Okay, let's look at the next piece of the puzzle, which involves the largest banking scandal you've never heard of. BCCI, the dirtiest bank of them all. Bank fraud cases are usually dry, tedious affairs. Not this one. Nothing in the history of modern financial scandals rivaled the unfolding saga of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Never had a single scandal involve so much money, so many nations, and so many prominent people. It was the largest corporate criminal enterprise ever, the biggest Ponzi scheme, the most pervasive money laundering operation ever created for the likes of Saddam Hussein and Colombian drug barons. BCCI was more than just a criminal bank. It had a clandestine division called the Black Network, which functioned as a global intelligence operation and a mafia-like enforcement squad. BCCI was used to funnel money during Iran-Contra. The bank also bribed public officials around the world and was protected by the Justice Department, which tried to derail any investigation. It was in the early 1980s, when deficits stopped mattering, that the Black Network began running its own drugs, weapons, and currency deals. Senior bankers feared that they would be physically maimed, even killed, if they were found talking about the BCCI's activities. It was a really nasty operation, and an integral part of the ESF's global dollar Ponzi scheme. The HIV=AIDS fraud, the enormous quantities of heroin and cocaine flooding the United States, quickly led to a deadly drug epidemic. By the mid-80s, the ESF's drug smuggling operation was so successful that kids were buying cocaine with their lunch money. The government's role in sparking this deadly epidemic has been reported on many times. For example, Gary Webb, an investigative reporter who won more than 30 journalism awards, including a Pulitzer Prize, in 1996 wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance. Based on extensive research and backed by a mountain of evidence, Dark Alliance described how the U.S. government was in fact involved in dumping cocaine into California, sparking the most destructive drug epidemic in American history. Now, heroin and cocaine are not healthy things, so if you start distributing tons of them into a country, hundreds of thousands of people will start to die. This is what happened in the 80s, when the ESF's flood of drugs led to a deadly epidemic in the drug-using community. People were dying because their immune systems were breaking down. In 1982, it was clear that this AIDS epidemic was not caused by an infectious disease. There was no evidence that the condition was spreading from person to person, and the general public didn't need to fear an epidemic. The condition did not spread to other family members, hospital workers, or researchers. Unless your life was filled with frequent sex and frequent drug use, you were in absolutely no danger of dying from AIDS. This AIDS epidemic became a threat to the ESF, who was in the process of piping as many tons of drugs into the US as it could. This is because Congress came under enormous pressure to do something because of the hundreds of thousands that were dying. Any crackdown on the true causes of the epidemic, especially drug use, would have been a problem. The ESF fixed the situation by turning to its Wurlitzer and inventing another cause for AIDS, the HIV virus.
We have a long way to go in the fight against HIV. The virus that causes AIDS. 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 The virus that causes AIDS.
Thanks to the HIV=AIDS fraud, the government handed out free needles instead of cracking down on drug use. To truly understand the facts about AIDS, watch the documentary HIV=AIDS, Fact or Fraud.
AIDS has failed to spread into the female population also. When the U.S. Army began testing new recruits for HIV in 1984, they discovered an amazing fact. HIV infection was evenly spread between males and females, 50-50, and it's remained that way since then. It should follow that AIDS would be 50% male and 50% female. Yet 9 out of every 10 people who develop AIDS continue to be male. This could explain why drug use is more related to AIDS than HIV infection. In the U.S., males use over 80% of all hard psychoactive drugs. AIDS is caused by recreational drug use, and injected drugs like heroin and cocaine are the direct cause of AIDS in 9 out of 10 cases.
The original papers upon which the HIV=AIDS myth was based were fabricated, and there aren't 26 million Africans dying of AIDS. That is another myth. The mighty Wurlitzer plays on. The elaborate scheme to save the dollar would not have been possible without the media's cooperation. The ESF's propaganda network allowed it to inject Americans with a synthetic reality, like the HIV=AIDS myth. But the Wurlitzer did much more than that, as demonstrated by what happened when Dark Alliance was published. The initial reaction to Gary Webb's Dark Alliance was dead silence. In other words, a total media blackout. You see, if the Time publishes an article on BCCI, and the rest of the nation's editors readers decide to ignore the story, it quickly withers and dies like a light-starved plant. Nothing sells like scandal, so when a story like BBCI is ignored, it's unnatural. Anyhow, Dark Alliance got the silence treatment big time. No one would touch it. But no one had counted on the enormous popularity of the website. Information that goes viral on the internet is perhaps the Wurlitzer's only weakness, so Dark Alliance developed a political momentum all on its own, and it happened despite a virtual news blackout from major media. Ultimately, public pressure forced the national newspapers into the fray, and when they spoke in unison. The official conclusion reached by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times was there's no story here. Dark Alliance was flawed. The way the mainstream press responded to the series was later described as one of the most venomous and factually insane assaults in living memory. Apparently, CNN helps the CIA redefine reality. Despite all the furor, the facts of a story never changed except to become more damning. But the perception of them did, and that's all that really mattered. Once a story becomes discredited, the rest of the media shies away from it, and it becomes consigned to the dustbin of history as an internet conspiracy theory. This is how undesired stories are brutally assaulted and killed. It works pretty damn well, too. You see, the media is free to report on all the sex scandals it wants. But when it comes to the real down and dirty stuff, that's where we see the limits of our freedom. In today's media environment, such stories are not even open for discussion. Gary Webb later died of 2 gunshot wounds to the head. It was ruled a suicide. The superdollar. Although the ESF managed to print money without causing inflation by dollarizing the rest of the world, it still was left with an enormous pool of greenbacks, whose return into the US could collapse the dollar. It needed some way to neutralize this threat and slow the return of these foreign dollars. This brings us to the superdollar, also known as the supernote, another massive, multi-decade, ongoing fraud that no one has heard of. The supernote is a counterfeit $100 bill that looks exactly like the real thing. Here's why the supernote is super. It contains every security feature of the real bill. It is printed on intaglio presses that only governments have access to. It is made with rag cotton paper. It contains tiny red and blue fibers. It has an embedded plastic strip, etc. There have been 19 versions so far. The supernotes are of such high quality and are updated so frequently that they could only be produced by a US government agency such as the ESF. After first being detected in 1989, the superdollar has spread, and soon countries like Russia were filled with high-quality fakes. At first, Iran and Syria were blamed, then criminal gangs in Russia or China, finally North Korea. However, this is unlikely. These notes go way beyond what normal counterfeiters are able to do. Also, supernotes appear to have been produced in quantities less than what it would cost to acquire the sophisticated machinery needed to make them. Whoever's doing it is apparently operating at a loss. There's more. Even though the counterfeiters have mastered infrared-sensitive security inks, the notes are produced in such a way that they have little chance of going undetected in America. In other words, the super sophisticated counterfeiters could make absolutely untraceable notes if they wanted to, but they don't. They deliberately produce them in a way that can be tracked by no one except the US government and other central banks. This phony 100 bill is not a fake anymore. It's an illegal parallel print of a genuine note. The supernote serves 2 purposes. 1, it increases ESF profits. 2, it helps to negate the threat posed by dollars in the rest of the world. Not only do superdollars never come back from abroad, they also make foreigners nervous about bringing their real dollars back to the US in case they turn out to be fake. Next, we need to discuss what would happen if the incoming flow of drugs were to dry up. First, the outgoing laundered dollars would be gone, leaving only the incoming dollars from abroad. Second, there would be no more profits from the war on drugs, which would mean a lot more printed money, and this would very quickly lead to problems for the ESF. I mention this because the incoming flow of drugs has been interrupted once before. Breakdown in the flow of heroin. In 1979, when the dollar was collapsing, the ESF's capital position was negative, and all hope for the dollar seemed lost, the CIA began its biggest covert operation ever, by supporting Osama bin Laden and other guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan. An integral part of the CIA's intervention was a huge increase in the production of opium and heroin, which have continued rising ever since. One of the key architects of all this was George W. Bush Sr. Anyhow, the heroin trafficking was handled by BBCI, up until its collapse in 1991, after which it was handled by a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda, and something went terribly wrong for the ESF Al-Qaeda heroin operation in 2001. You see, in the fall of 2000, the Taliban announced a total ban on the cultivation of opium. Taliban militia then went out and burned heroin labs and drugs. The ban was a success. Of course, the world refused to recognize this good deed. In fact, the US hit Afghanistan with sanctions. Despite this, the betting was the ban was going to hold up. Heroin stocks were going down and they wouldn't be replaced. The Taliban's eradication of poppies was probably the most dramatic event in the history of illegal drug markets. There was no chance that opium from other sources could compensate for the loss, and by June opium had gone up 5 to 7 times in price. Now you remember what happens when the flow of drugs gets interrupted, right? Well, as seen on the Fed's website, things started to get really interesting around the middle of 2001. Now at the beginning of the year everything was normal. The growth of currency was in single digits. But as July came around, that changed. By August, the amount of dollars in circulation was soaring. The increase in currency in circulation from June to August 2001 was the largest in recorded history. Deficits were about to start mattering again. But then, in September 2001, 9/11 happened. One skyscraper collapsed. Then a second skyscraper collapsed. Finally, a third skyscraper, World Trade Center 7, collapsed. No one has really explained why this third skyscraper collapsed. Also unexplained is why molten steel was found weeks after 9/11 at Ground Zero.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later. It's probably 1,500 degrees.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. At one point, I think there were about 2,800 degrees. There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
Finally, no one has explained why scientists around the world are finding nanothermite, a military-grade explosive, in the dust from 9/11. This is a peer-reviewed paper published in a scientific journal for those of you who know what that means. The flow of heroin is restored. September 11 solved the ESF's heroin problem. By October, heroin was flooding into the West. Wholesale prices dropped, and farmers went back to growing poppies. By the next year, opium production was back where it was supposed to be. However, the invasion did more than just restore Afghan poppy production. It took it to a whole new level. Most of this increase came from Helmand province. And guess who controls this Helmand province?
You know, they have these opium fields, and we are tolerating it. We are tolerating the cultivation of the opium. Here you have one of the best fighting forces in the world ever mounted. And in a sense, you're watching as this opium is being grown.
Afghanistan now produces 93% of the world's opium, and it is being grown under the protection of US troops. Predictably, the skyrocketing production has had deadly domestic implications. By 2006, Afghan heroin was potent, cheap, and pouring into the US, causing a surge in heroin-related deaths. And the problem has continued to grow as heroin has roared back to life in America, killing more and more people across the US. Also predictably, Afghanistan got hit by an AIDS epidemic. Although the country used to have negligible rates of AIDS, the US then invaded and turned it into the largest producer of heroin in the world, and now AIDS is killing thousands.